Okay, so it looks like we are live, and I would like to welcome everybody to the business of. Thank you guys for being here. So the business of is a podcast series that is streaming live and recorded, where we will cover a wide range of topics related to business, nonprofit, economic development, local government. It is the fruit of a partnership and collaboration between Aim and Build Consulting and Development and the Library of Spokane. And it is brought to you by the Spokane Public Library and recorded in the media studio at the Central Library. Today, we will be covering with our guests the business of data. And before we jump in, I just wanted to explain a little bit how this idea came, of starting a podcast. So honestly, it started with a very simple fact, which is that I'm a very lucky guy. I'm surrounded by very smart people, and we get to talk a lot about different topics. And as we were trying to create a workshop series, we're having conversations about that, and then realized that we wanted a structure that was a little less rigid and more conversational about the topics that we're going to cover. So, like I said, today we're covering the business of data, and let's start by maybe just a very short introduction, if you guys don't mind, about like your name and your job, and then we'll start talking a little bit more about your work with data.
I'm Lou, or Lacrecia. I'm also own my own consulting company, LMH Consulting. I also have had the privilege of being an MBA and working in nonprofit and the for-profit sector.
I'm Don Snyder, and I'm founder and counselor at Damn Good Knives. Kind of taking a step back from the corporate side of things and exercising my entrepreneurial chops there. But yeah, I come out of primarily recruiting in financial services and technology. And I've worked on applying data skills to those disciplines.
I'm Mark Bond. I'm the business research librarian for the Spokane Public Library. And a good chunk of any given day for me is spent working with startups, folks trying to put together some business plans, marketing plans, sales projections, those sorts of things. So data is my world.
Awesome. Mark, do you want to dive a little bit more about and maybe start on what's your work with data? How would you explain your work with data?
Yeah, so Spokane Public Library, we've got a pretty rocking set of business research tools. A lot of it is diving into how many businesses are within a certain geographic region. So if you're in the B2B world and you've got some service or widget to business plans. So pulling that type of information together, that's a little bit more straightforward and kind of easy to deal with. But also some pretty deep dives into more of the consumer world of individual households and who's spending how much on what. And if you want a list of dog owners in Spokane County that are over 65 years old, we can do that and get you their names and addresses and phone numbers. So that's kind of the flavor and type of data that I tend to work with.
And just for the people who are watching, it is available to any resident of Spokane.
Yes,
right. It's a free service.
It is free, especially if you live here in the Spokane region.
And free, we should say, people are already paying for it.
Yes, good point.
Paying taxes.
Yes, there's free, like, hey, I found this couch on the sidewalk type of free. And then there's free, like, oh, it's already paid for type of free. Yeah.
Okay. And it's accessible to anyone.
Yeah. So if you're outside the Spokane region, get in touch with me. We can work out something. We have what's called a non-resident card. So for a price, folks can kind of buy into the system.
And I mean, people in business, small business, bigger businesses, people who want to start a business, business students, like
all of the above,
right?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Mark. Don, do you want to tell us a little bit like your experience with data? Like, what's your work with data?
Sure. Well, I'll work backwards actually, since Mark was last. Most recently, I've done a lot of data work in Spokane, having met Mark when I first moved here, kind of discovering what resources were available in the library. And at that time, I was working with a lot of real estate professionals. And so, part of my value add for working with them was the ability to find ever increasing amounts of data, and sometimes some really very specific data that they didn't know that they would have access to help identify where their potential clients would lie, and to really help hone in on how we could best use their time and maximize their efficiency through the use of data. Prior to that, I got started with data back in 2014. I was recruiting for kind of a security technology company. They had a project going where they brought in some consultants from Southwest Airlines to use their knowledge, and they are very, very data driven. And so we combine that with some of my knowledge and research about the data of recruiting, which is an industry that, at least in the pockets that I've worked in, has been pretty data free, very old school. And so I was looking at how can we use the technology and the information available to us to make this more effective. Transferred that into my work in the financial services industry. And then the last thing I did there in financial services with data was to develop a recruiting program where you could actually look at really specific metrics that were automatically recorded for you using business process automation tools to make sure that you're spending your time and resources appropriately. So that's, and then of course too, opening Damn Good Nuts, my very first call was to Mark, and he was able to point me in the right direction, give me some good information that has helped me along the way substantially.
Okay, awesome. And what about Lulu?
Yeah, I've gotten the opportunity to work in nonprofit data. And that's kind of where I got my start. Specifically got my bachelor's degree in psychology because I wanted to do research data on humans. So in the nonprofit sector, you're really looking at who you're serving, so those demographic information, and then looking at the types of interventions that you're providing, and then gauging whether those interventions show a change in behavior. And also doing it through the lens when you're doing direct service, it's so hard to collect information and then turn around to make it useful for the folks that are doing that hard work, and being able to do it in a way that doesn't take away from the work that they're doing when you're working on direct service. And that really was what inspired me in terms of data and how we use it to inspire folks and how to get folks talking about the right solutions for humans, especially on the nonprofit sector from my experience. And that's where I kind of have found my sweet spot is operations. So how does technology and people work together to meet objectives? And so that also led me for the for-profit sector. In there, it was very much production. And so, what are our numbers? How much are we producing? Can we meet our demand, or do we need to pull back? And so being able to, and also being able to talk to different types of humans about their production numbers so that it's meaningful to them, and so that you can see that change or adjustment based on the needs of the entity. And so that's how I have gotten involved in data. And then I was also exposed to the consumer response, or who your consumer is, as Mark says, what your market is, and how you're able to reach the people that you can get to purchase your widget or your product.
Awesome. Awesome. So, and I'll ask a few questions, and whoever wants to start can just start. I would love to know about what you've experienced since you've been working in that field, like the best and the worst case scenario, the best use of data that you've seen with companies that have consulted with you, that you work for or work with. Yeah, whoever wants to start. Or you want me to select something? Dad, you look like yours ready.
Give me 1 second to think about that.
Okay. Which
I mean, I can definitely, I love to talk about
sure.
it.
Yeah, go
Fire
ahead,
away.
go ahead.
So the challenge, I think, for me, it's always collecting too much or too little. And so it's that sweet spot and how much data you need to collect. When you're on the nonprofit side, there are a lot of grants or the dollars that are coming into your entity that you have to report to. And being able to utilize technology to really create some efficiencies around how you're collecting that information are key. And then also understanding what your industry is and collecting that data appropriately. Not every, you don't always need every single piece of data that your data system collects, at the same time, you want to make sure that you're meeting the needs of the people, your stakeholders or the people that you're working with, and enough information to help you make good decisions. And I think that's where it gets kind of hard. It's like sometimes you want all this information. In the cannabis industry, we were obviously collecting a lot of data. And one of the biggest pieces of data we were collecting it was really hard to collect, but it was our yield. So we were extracting cannabis into its concentrated form. Well, what we really kind of were finding out is what strains what that yield the highest amount, but also what are those terpene profiles. And so that was data that we were collecting, but it wasn't very useful at the time, but it's kind of industry knowledge data that in the future will be very, very useful. But at the time, when you're dealing with a bunch of lab folks who in a new industry is just trying to get the product to market, it is really hard to collect that information and create a system and process around it, knowing that you're kind of taking away from production time, knowing that you need to collect that information and not even having the data or the software to be able to support you. So having these really robust spreadsheets where you're collecting information and then, trying to figure out how that works. And then also the realities in that particular industry is that there are many data systems that won't support your information. And so we had to kind of piecemeal different types of data systems together to be able to make sure that our financial data is matching up with our production data. And so I think those are kind of the challenges that I've always faced in the operations side is how much do we need to collect, how little, making sure we're not collecting too much, making sure we're meeting the needs of the stakeholder, and also looking to the future and thinking about what might be useful or information moving forward.
I have a question that might be based on a real prejudice. I'll be honest about that. When I think cannabis world, I don't think data. And was it a difficult push to implement data research analysis?
No, it wasn't, because it's production. And I think we think that folks who are in cannabis aren't thinking about, our profit margins, like much of production, are very small, especially in a new industry and a limited market. And so we had to think of those production numbers and information. And our business started running much more smoothly when we really implemented the production side. And I will say producer processors, those of, farmers, growers, and those of us doing extraction, we had to rely on data from the point of bringing in material, knowing those timelines, like all of that was data that was meeting the needs of our consumer. And that's how we were able to be one of the top 10 brands in the state, keeping in mind that we only have our state economy to work with. Okay. And so, yeah, I think that that's a huge misconception in the cannabis industry. We rely very heavily on our data and our relationships and understanding the product that we're producing, the chemicals that we're using in that data, the difference in the different hydrocarbons or combination of hydrocarbons that we could use in terms of the yields that we were getting. So it's science, especially on that production processing side of it.
Okay, cool. Well, I love being wrong. Like
yeah. No, it's I think there's a huge, they think in that industry that everybody's just sitting around getting stoned, and wouldn't that be nice? But it's actually in the WAC law that you cannot be noticeably intoxicated on the premises, and
I think
we
without
help people to that
without necessarily thinking of like everybody getting stoned, but
yeah,
it's an industry that I think of as someone really started with a job, and then it turned out into like a bigger industry. And so like my assumption is with this kind of trajectories, sometimes getting more professional and using more professional tools is not an easy shift, but apparently not.
There were certain things that were hard. I think what the hard part was proprietary information. I'm sorry, it's getting much more into cannabis, but it's the proprietary information and getting people to write down their processes were much harder than collecting the data. They wanted to know the data, and many of those folks, I call them backyard scientists, because they are actually obsessively interested in plant information, soil information, things that I did not know were important. And just like any farmer, the quality of your soil is super important, and they're doing lots of data around, the bio realities of their soil. And the same thing is true for cannabis. I always said, we're farmers, we're manufacturers, and we have a lab where we make science. So it's similar to making perfumes or essential oils.
Awesome. So yeah, thank you for describing a
Yeah.
little bit how it works.
Yeah,
This
it's-
is amazing.
I think, the biggest brands in the state are spending a lot of time on tech. I know Fat Panda has gotten into more of, what is that, artificial intelligence in terms of the manufacturing. We were looking to manufacturing many times to figure out how we were going to do what we were going to do, and then talking to manufacturers about modifying their production tools to meet our needs. So it was probably the biggest part was figuring out, and that yield information, nobody's like, and the information that's coming through the labs, because every single piece of material has to be tested, like that data is golden. In those testing labs are going to make a ton of, and not just money on testing the product, but on the information that they're pulling from that product.
Do you guys want to share a little bit about like other industries or your experience of like best use of data?
Yeah, I mean, I can say the best use of data that I've personally been involved in was, when I was at Cornerstone Home Lending, we were looking at how can we identify the employment patterns of the specific loan officers that we wanted to recruit, right? Because we have really particular
So
metrics about who we were
Can you explain
interested in
that?
hiring.
Like employment patterns. So like what was their past employment trajectory?
Right. So where are they employed? How long are they staying there? How long or when are they switching to other companies? And
Okay.
where is the bulk of their production occurring over the arc of several years, right? Because we were looking for, we want top producers and we want people who are going to stay here for a while, just because it takes so long to integrate somebody into your program. And so through a combination of just, scraping and publicly available data, and then some kind of creative combinations, just look at how top producers were moving along in their career so that we could find ways to interject ourselves in our recruiting process before they get to that one place where their production explodes and they stay there for 10 or 15 years, right? Because we knew we had the tools to help them dramatically increase their production. We can do that for the individual. So how do we insert ourselves into their awareness at the right time and provide kind of an offer to them that's going to be appealing, bring them over. And so, basically, what I found was that, the top producers that we were looking for tended to switch jobs a maximum of once, or switch companies a maximum of once every 4 years.
Okay.
They tended to operate within the same market for a minimum of about 15, 17 years. And it was a really interesting approach to figuring out not just where are my customers, right? Because that's in mortgage pretty easy, because all of them want to be as visible as they possibly can be, but how do we identify the right time to approach that person? Where in that employment cycle are they likely to be facing a buying decision? And so it really helped eliminate a lot of the manual data collection that's done by just picking up the phone and calling people, right? Which is a tried and true approach for recruiting. You pick up the phone and you just ask them where they're at in their decision process. But we can eliminate a lot of that just by using publicly available data to just identify, where's this person at? What is the statistical likelihood that they're going to be the person we want, and that this is the time that we could best approach them.
Other industries where you've noticed, like where you've had really good experiences with data, or that you want to dive in, or
honestly, I think that my best time with data was working with realtors, and it's, kind of like cottage use of data. It's not big data. We're pulling from big data, but really we're looking for one individual contributor. How can we maximize what you're doing and your time spent, but these are individual entrepreneurial people who have limited amounts of time and a tremendous amount of other responsibilities. So it helped me to be able to apply data in alignment with my philosophy. If we can't use numbers to help make people's lives better, then really what's the point?
and yeah, I know we haven't necessarily prepared for that question, so if you don't have the answer right now, that's totally fine. But I know once you explained that thought process of like how you helped realtors with data, would you be able to explain like in a couple sentences, like you explained that to me back then, of like what you took them through, and I think you use the library tools, right?
I did, yes. So probably my favorite data set that I worked on with that, because I tailored it to each individual that I was working with because they wanted to work with different types of people. But I think the one that was most productive, we were looking at people moving into the area from somewhere else and being employed when they arrived. And we're looking at how long are they typically going to rent or not purchase a home before they enter the market, right? How long are they going to spend officially in the housing market, which is kind of difficult to quantify. But we were able to narrow it down and then figure out where are those people located in the community and where can I get the contact information for them without overstepping or having to do it all manually. And that information was largely available just through all of the resources that Mark shares here at the library. We were able to put together in a matter of a day or two mailing lists for 500, 600, 700 people who were like at peak likelihood of being within 6 months of entering the real estate market. And that helped my folks be able to send out less direct mail, which was a huge cost savings to them, and really focus their efforts on being where those people were.
Okay. So like the myth of like for a profession like being a realtor, being all about networking and all that stuff, like not that people need to stop doing it, but it would be pretty easy to use tools like that.
Right. I mean, and the networking part is certainly not a myth of successful realtors. It is an important element of it. But when you're informing your approach with data, you can figure out where should I be networking? Who should I be networking with? The people who I want to work with, who are they currently in contact with? And how can I be enough of a value add that it's worth their time to network back with me, right? So it just informs those decisions to put you in the right place at the right time.
Awesome. Mark, some question, like observation of like best practices with data, or
I think one that really stands out was I'll try to protect patron confidentiality here, but company here in town that had a service that they were people that trying to market, and they were doing really well. They were really just killing it, but they were marketing to kind of mid-20s to mid-40-year-old folks. That's who they thought their target market was. And we have some tools within the library's toolbox, specifically, can I totally geek out here, but Mosaic Experian data, where it really breaks down to a really fine-grained level of at the household level, who's spending what on what products. And it gets you down to the point of like, okay, how likely are they to drive Subarus versus Kias? Do they pay their bills online? Yes, no, maybe. So we can get to really fine-grained levels of data along those fronts, but also with that same tool, we can take addresses of customers who are signing up for the service that this company was providing, run it through this filter from Experian, and then be able to see, wow, we were marketing to 20 to 45-year-olds. The bulk of our customers, like 60, 70% of them, are well-to-do senior citizens. But wow, okay, well, we're doing okay doing what we're doing, but let's set up a separate marketing track aiming at the folks who are actually purchasing our stuff. And that was kind of a real aha moment for me of like, okay, that is a really good use of data. It's stuff that's publicly available through the library, but also being able to then kind of smush it together and combine it with proprietary data that company itself was sitting on that no one else really had access to. That seems to be kind of the real shining star when you can take data from these different silos, smush them together into something that's unique that probably only you are sitting on. Then I think that's the horse to ride.
I think I know which company you're talking about.
Yeah.
But so when people don't use, like, just a quick question, whoever they were marketing to before that, Like, what is it based on? Just like a gut feeling, or like I have a feeling sometimes companies think their clients look like them,
Mhm.
or I don't know. Like, do you know what it's based on?
In that particular example, I'm not exactly sure how they landed on that. Often it's just trial and error, just like, let's splatter our message up against the wall and see who responds, which, that's a certain strategy. But if you've got some data to say, yeah, 19% of this age group over here will respond, but 63% of this age group are going to respond. We all live in a world of constrained time and money, so go for the 63% response rate.
Well, I think that's what data is. It's your gut check, because I think that it's very common in business, especially if you're an entrepreneur or, or you're in that industry. You tend to be like, well, this is what I'm thinking this. And I think what data really does is it gives us a gut check. It makes us think, okay, are my assumptions right? Or do I need to kind of recheck where my assumptions are?
I like that. Then that goes to the other half of the question about the worst uses of data, right? Because when you misuse your gut check, it's going to get bad. And I don't want to talk about specifics when we're talking about negatives, unless we're big multinationals or something. But no, and it's something I see over and over again at all levels of management and education and everything, but you have a gut feeling about what the answer is, and you want to validate that so that you can sell it to whoever that decision maker is who's going to give you the go ahead. And when you get the data back, instead of saying like, oh, my assumption was wrong, you're going, that data is garbage. Go get me new data. Give me a new report. Find data that validates my gut, right? It's the worst possible use of it. Like, what a waste of money, effort, resources to just try to validate whatever you want versus find out the objective truth of the matter. It happens a lot.
And I think with that
It
too,
does happen a lot.
another comparable effect that I've observed a couple of times is when data confirms something that we believed, people were like, well, it's a waste of money. When
right.
It actually really isn't.
Well, and I think in the world of data, you're trying to disprove your hypothesis. And I think that that's what's forgotten. Data just kind of gets thrown out there into the general ethos. But those of us who have been studying data, if you're looking at, the approach to evaluating your hypothesis, you really do set out to disprove it. And if you're not setting out to disprove your hypothesis, then you're actually not really finding the true nature if you're right or not. And I think that was really hard, even in the cannabis industry, when I was like, oh no, we're going to try to disprove this. And they're like, whoa, don't we want, I was like, no. When you're doing research, you want to disprove your hypothesis. And I can give you in the nonprofit sector, especially youth service in the mid 2010s, it was very popular to have volunteer mentors. And I was just going nuts because I was watching these terrible volunteer mentors come into the Boys and Girls Clubs. Our kids hated them. They were poorly trained. They wanted to do something good, but they were having the mentors were having an awful experience and their kids were having an awful experience. And John Hopkins was doing a study at the time on Boys and Girls Clubs and our mentorship programs. And I'm just sitting at these funders and I'm like, volunteer mentors don't work. Our paid staff who we train, they're amazing. Our work study students are people from the community who come to work for us, who have similar lived experience of our youth. Those folks work. Hit and miss with volunteers. If you get a volunteer with a cool interest, great. But the data was not showing that our volunteers weren't sticking around and they weren't connecting with the kids at a level that was showing a change in their attendance, behavior, and coursework. And so that was a situation where we changed what that looked like. Boys and Girls Club stopped pushing for volunteer mentors and started really looking at our staff and reinvesting in our staff as those mentors and increasing our number of staff.
Interesting. Mark, any worst case that you've observed?
I think the one that pops to mind, it's on my shoulders in that not being fully aware of the shortcomings of the data that we have access to. Good example, we have a couple different databases that are able to pull together those lists of plumbers around the nation. And, I knew that any tool like that, it's trying to hit a moving target. So there's going to be misses and there are going to be some things that it should include that it won't. So I knew that there's some margin of error there, but it wasn't until embarrassing late into my librarian career using these tools that I realized, oh, at least in Washington State, I don't know if this holds true across the entire nation, but if you run a list, say in Reference Solutions, used to be called Reference USA, it's our primary business database. If you say, show me all of the businesses in Spokane County, it'll show a list of something like 28,000 businesses. And fairly recently, I contacted the Department of Revenue and said, hey, how many businesses do you have in Spokane County? And it was close to 60,000. And I'm like, well, that's almost a 2-to-1 difference. That's huge. And what I discovered was the database that we subscribe to, they're just scraping business license filings from the Secretary of State. So if you're an LLC, S Corp, C Corp, you'll show up. If you're a sole proprietor, you don't have a presence with the Secretary of State. And so depending on the industry, it can be a massive undercounting of reality and what's actually out there. So I guess in terms of bad uses of data, just not being aware of the limitations of the data and how detailed and fine grained of a bit of insight that you're getting. If you just get a report back and say, oh, gospel truth, all right, I'm going to go run with it. Be inquisitive and be skeptical about the data that's coming back to you.
Quality of data.
Yeah, quality, currency. Is there anyone behind the scenes with a thumb on the scale having any sort of influence on how the data is presented one way or the other, if they are stand to benefit from one set of data versus another? Those are all things that need to be considered, especially, I mean, if it's your own data that you're pulling from your own company, you can kind of have some quality controls
You still
there.
have to be, you still have to be
So
very
much.
skeptical.
Right?
It reminds me of, I mean, I saw this one firsthand where a Salesforce administrator had moved on and somebody else had taken their place, and reports were being run based on existing options that you could select in Salesforce. Because this person didn't know that there were previous options that had been selected, right? I mean, essentially we had dirty data because it wasn't updated, but those were really important data points that were left completely out of the report because this person's only selecting for what they can personally see at this point in time, and neglecting some really important information that they could have grabbed just by going back and seeing whether other options were there, or seeing if data could be cleaned up to better conform to the data set that they're trying to work with.
You've all heard the late Blockbuster story, right? Like have you heard the story of how they used data that obviously didn't serve them very well? I thought I heard that from you. No,
I was probably just making it up.
well, no,
Check
you
your
know, at
sources.
the time where Netflix was starting to transition towards streaming, Blockbuster ran a huge survey to see if people would be interested in streaming, and I think it relates to your point. And massively, people said no. No. The only issue is that they only surveyed Blockbuster users,
Right.
and not like the general audience. So Blockbuster, pretty much died of that. So yeah, I really thought I heard that from you.
Could have been.
The whole thing, like the veracity of your data, reminds me of like one of my all-time favorite examples of really bad use of data. 2010, two of the United States top economists, extremely highly regarded, were taking a look at GDP versus national debt, saying if your GDP or if your national debt exceeds about 90% of your GDP, right, you're in trouble. Your economy is going to start contracting. They're using like a 0.2% indicator there, and they weren't releasing their data to the public. But they wrote a paper about it. It wasn't peer reviewed because they were so highly regarded. They went on speaking engagements all around the world. Public policy was written and enacted based on this belief from these guys that they use the data correctly to say your economy will shrink if you exceed 90% debt, right? College student gets a hold of the Excel spreadsheet that they used. That's how they compiled and parsed their data, and found that the researchers didn't select the whole column. They'd left out 4 countries, including Canada and Japan, that completely shifted the findings of the report and made it look like it was potentially desirable to have greater than 90%. So, I mean, when they included the whole list of countries, it was a positive number. And I don't want to commit to something, but it was higher than 1%. The amount of growth that they saw was significantly higher than the amount of contraction that was supposed to occur in that instance. So veracity, knowing where your data came from, what's in it, how clean it is, those things are just so important.
And I think the nonprofit sector, like, there's a need or desire to appease your funder instead of being honest about what your intervention is producing. And when I talked about the mentorship, so many of those entities wanted to appease their funder instead of just being really honest about what their experience was. And now we're stuck with all of these major policies and funding channels that want to do volunteer one-on-one mentoring, and I'm just like, this doesn't work. But that is the reality when we don't teach people to be honest or to scrutinize the information that's coming into them.
So one of the main things that I've heard from all of you, I think, is like that kind of approach where people want data to confirm what they already believe, and they're going to ask for more and more data until it does. What other common thread have you noticed in the worst practices? Like I think there's something about asking the right questions, like before diving into data. So can you guys talk a little bit about that? And how do, like, okay, there's a company that wants to look at data for whatever aspect of their company. How do they ensure that they have this approach? Is it something that they have to do internally? Is it something that they have to do with other people that come from like external resources? Or
It depends.
but let's start with the first question. Maybe like, how do you ensure that you're asking the right questions when you want to look at data? Is there a way?
Collaboration and consultation. Get out of your office, talk to other people, talk to people who don't know anything about what you're looking at. A completely fresh set of eyes, in my opinion, is the best way to get it done.
I definitely don't silo yourself. I think that is the biggest key and to check your sources and double check your sources and understand where your raw material or raw data is coming from and be really honest about what those limitations could be. Many times when I do a data report, I have to mention where the limitations are. Recently with you, did a company and looked at their hiring and firing and their retention data. And I had to be really honest. I was like, hey, some of this retention data isn't going to be, it's going to seem higher than it should because these are the pieces that I'm missing to give you better retention data. So in the future, I would suggest collecting this information so that your retention data is better tracked. And those are the kinds of things. I think when you approach data through a lens of learning versus confirming, it becomes a much funner process.
I love that. That's so good.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other comments on that?
Yeah, it's kind of echoing what has already been said, but just kind of making sure that you're framing the question so that you know the answer that you're getting back. Like there's and I was working with recently that he's interested in starting up a business for helping seniors with their digital life, being safe online and setting up Facebook accounts, that sort of thing. And through one of our databases, we can say, all right, show us folks over 65 in the 99203 zip code that are internet users and go online. And there was somebody else in the room. They're like, oh my God, that's awesome. There's your list right there. And he was a little more hesitant. It's like, well, is it though? And I was like, yeah, that's the question, because this list, these are the proficient users. These are the folks that are showing up on these marketing lists of like, oh, okay, they have a propensity already to be online. It's not your novices, that they're not on this list. I mean, you might be marketing to these people, but they're probably already set and they kind of know what it is that they need to know. They're navigating through just fine. So to just pull together a list of senior citizen internet users, yeah, that'll probably capture a good chunk of who you're looking for, but to just kind of run with that and say, oh my God, that's exactly what I need. Take a pause and just kind of step back, take a walk around the block, go stare at the river for a while, and then come back to it.
Yeah, I feel like so. Yeah, I was an assistant to Mark or volunteer for Mark's department for a little
Volunteers. Oh my God, don't get me started.
while. Right.
No, Alex was a great volunteer.
Oh, thank you. No, it was such a great experience
It's
because
hit or
like
miss.
we like in meeting with clients or users of the library services, the questions were sometimes so vague. And it's almost like they were waiting for data to tell them what question to ask.
Mhm.
And so I remember quite often, we had to just close the computer before looking at the databases and just say like, okay, let's just work on your question. Because at the end of the day, data doesn't have a religion or direction or an inclination. So it will just give you an answer as smart as the question you ask. Do you feel that's the case, or with your experience?
Yeah.
I was just thinking about this quote that I heard today, or I reheard today. You know, they said there's truth, there's lies, and there's statistics.
Interesting.
Data is agnostic.
Mhm.
Data is exactly what it is. It doesn't tell you anything until you start asking questions, right? Statistics, on the other hand, are influenced by preferences and by preconceived notions and by really bad logic. A lot of people who look at data are not logisticians, right? And so can often ask a question not realizing that it's not asking what they think it is. And yeah, I think that, you know, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right that it's and I'm sorry, I just completely lost my train of thought.
Let's just stop with you, right?
Yeah,
It is.
yeah, we'll stop with you're right. Absolutely.
That's solid data. Question that I have a couple more questions here. One thing that I've noticed when we start working with companies that often go from a transition to not using a lot of data to really getting it, is that they're starting measuring everything and getting data on everything. How do you focus on the right data? And here, there's also like a book that we talked about. And so I don't
Yeah.
if you want to.
Yes, I'm obsessed. It's Measure What Matters.
are
It's
obsessed.
objectives and key results.
Okay.
And really, and that's kind of
I was talking over you, so let's say the title again.
Measure What Matters.
Measurement.
And it comes from Google. It's objectives and key results, and really, and it looks at objectives and key results, your committed objectives, you know, those SMART objectives that you're going to meet, and then your key performance indicators, which really fuel if you're meeting those objectives and key results. And really, a lot of your key results are your collection of those key performance indicators. And I would just say, you don't have to collect everything. You want to be thoughtful of the size of your company, the data system that you're using, what's easy to pull, what really drives your business to be successful. And there's tools out there to help you. So if you're going into marketing and you're at the point where you need a marketing firm, they have great tools to figure out how you need to reach your audience. And you can allow them to do that. Don't be afraid to reach out to other services or other businesses to support your end goal. You don't have to do everything yourself. But if you're interested in it really lights a fire, there are resources out there to educate you about collecting data, about making sure your diagnostic information is good. Coursera is a really great tool, I think, for folks, because it can teach you how to use data, how to look at data, how to read data, whether you want to do it from, just for your company, or whether you want to look at your industry. I think that there's really great tools out there and free education tools as well that can help you learn what you need to learn, and then be honest about, hey, I don't want to do this. There might be people out there or individuals that can help you find that. And I think with those key performance indicators, it's like, find them. You don't have to, there doesn't have to be 400 key performance indicators. There should be a handful, and that's really going to help you be thoughtful about the decisions you're making for your company.
Do you mind explaining the difference between a KPI and an OKR?
Yeah, your objectives and key results are going to be a larger goal. It won't always have to do with numbers. Your key performance indicators, they're numbers, and they usually fit into your objectives and key results. Your objectives, your OKRs fit, your KPIs fit into your OKRs. I always think of kind of your KPI as your scorecard. So you'll hear that a lot in business. That's how you're tracking, you know, how many people are you serving? How many sales did you make? How many of an individual item did you sell? And I think, you know, you can go online and look, you know, this is my industry. What are people tracking? And then, you know, maybe a few times a year you go into a deeper dive. But I think that, you know, I always say, like, what you pay attention to gets attended to. And so just having that monthly, weekly, bi-weekly check-in of where those numbers are at really help you make good business decisions. And it also calms your soul. And I think that's what happens too in business, especially if you're an entrepreneur, especially, you know, there's a lot at stake, and those numbers can help you feel a lot better. And you're like, oh, no, we're doing it. Because I think sometimes you're in the mix of it and you're like, oh my gosh, are we really doing this? And then when you look back at the numbers, when you look at what you've produced, you're like, oh, no, like we totally did it. And I think that's how you kind of help decide what you're tracking, why you're tracking it, and not finding yourself in this huge balloon of just information.
Okay. Awesome. If you guys don't mind, like, telling us a little bit too about how would you help companies measure what matters, and then we'll take a couple of questions. We have a couple of questions online in the chat. But yeah, how do you?
That's a good question. Probably many answers, but one that bubbles to the top immediately is just some benchmarking approaches to know what's normal in your industry. And are you outperforming? Are you underperforming? Where do you sit? And plug for library resource. RMA database, Risk Management Association. You know, you can plug in your whole income sheet, your balance sheet, and then depending on your industry, compare it to other businesses that are same size as yours, but in the same industry, to see, oh, wow, half of my assets are tied up in inventory. Industry average is 25%. What's going on? Why do I have so much stuff sitting on the shelf that I paid for that's not generating any revenue? So I think that would be one that I can think of just right off the top, of just knowing where you stand. High, low, average, below average.
It's a great answer. You know, I think for me, it's, you know, getting a baseline for where they're at, obviously, is the first step to anything, but it's analyzing, have you collected that data? What is the purpose of having that data, and what systems are you using to analyze it? So especially when we're talking about much smaller companies, when you don't have a dedicated data professional, it can be just too big of a task to even start. But by saying, like, okay, let's whittle this data down to a really manageable amount. Let's put it into a program like Excel. You can run over 2 million lines of data through Excel. It's shockingly powerful, especially if you're in the cloud. And a lot of people don't know that you can do that. And showing people that just what tools are available to them to use. There's an AI engine built into Excel now, right? Sure. There is, yeah. You can, there are buttons that you can click that just say, analyze this and tell me what you think. You don't even have to give it any parameters or tell it what information you want, and it'll show you beautiful reports with graphs and, I mean, great visualizations. They can, you know, just looking at that AI generated data can help push you in the right direction of learning what questions to ask, right? Because what is AI basing that report on. It's basing it on what everybody else is looking at for their OKRs and KPIs and whatnot. So I think just identifying what tools are you using, what's available to you, and are you getting the most out of it is usually the best place to start. So you don't pile on a bunch of extra extremely expensive tools that they don't really need.
And I think to build on what all three of you are saying, there's this saying that if you're in business, you're in sales. I think like sometimes I think if you're in business, you're also in research. And part of it is a good way to know if you're measuring what actually matters is to give yourself a test period. Like over 3 months, did it get closer? Did it get you closer or your organization closer to the goal you're after? I mean, every business has a goal, whatever every organization has a goal. So, okay. Well, on that note, let's see what questions we have. Alina.
Yeah, so we have a question from one of the audience members that says, how does one double check your data? It would be hypothetically possible that if I checked the correct data against incorrect data, it stands that I could accidentally misunderstand what the data actually says.
It depends on how you actually want to just look at your raw data, like going through that spreadsheet and just looking at it. Like you're going to notice, especially as you continue to do it. And I'll just use many of us, it doesn't matter if you're in retail or anything, you have some type of data system that is tracking the sales or the movement of whatever you're doing. And so being able to kind of just skim that Excel spreadsheet that you're pulling, because most of those data systems, you could pull the data from that. And I always want to remind people too, your data system is just a bunch of spreadsheets laid on top of each other. Like they make it seem, they just made it pretty for you so you don't have to look at those ugly spreadsheets. But when helping somebody, and a lot of times in your search options in your data systems, you can set those up. Even in QuickBooks, you can set those up to kind of email to you on a regular basis. And then just taking that Excel spreadsheet and look at it, just kind of scanning it, making sure all the dates are there, making sure there's no weird transaction or funny numbers in there. And obviously with the big data for market research, that can get a little bit more challenging and you might need some other tools for that. But I think if you're a business and you're pulling from the data system that you've committed to, whether it's Salesforce or whatever you choose to use, skimming it, giving it a good once over. I have found so many things like, oh my gosh, I just saw a chunk of duplicates. I knew they were duplicates. They had the same, usually there's some type of number that indicates that line of data. So just being able to scan and take a little look through it, you're going to find sometimes sorting it, because you can usually sort your data in a certain section. So you can see maybe if there's like a number that's coming up and the same number is repeated. Oh no, I've pulled a repeating number. I think that none of these data systems are perfect and they will make mistakes. And I think that that's one way. And then access the people that you're getting your software from, harass them. They are your friends. They will help you. They will teach you what you need to look for. They can help you pull those and set up those reports. So I always tell people, if you're going to use a data system, use it to the fullest capacity, understand who that data system is being provided by, and make them your friend. Make them want to talk to you, ask them questions. If you feel like something's not quite right, reach out to them and ask them. And a lot of times they're able to help you.
Do you guys want to add to that answer?
Yeah, in my world, it's usually third-party data providers that I'm working with. So I feel like one of the beauties of my job is that I don't have to be a salesperson for demographics now. I can say, this is a really good tool for X, Y, and Z, but shortcomings are 1, 2, and 3. Just be aware of that. So for double checking data, finding a trusted advisor, someone who kind of knows the system, and whether it's your sales rep, which sometimes you go into that with the eyes wide open, like there's the sales rep, their job is to sell me on this. But also if you've got someone in your circle where you can say, hey, you know this universe really well, can I buy you a beer and have you just sit down and chat this through?
Don, any
No, those were entirely adequate answers. Check, skim it,
Look at it.
The person who was responsible for whatever activity generated that data is the best possible person to be skimming it, right? Give me the last 30 days of whatever it is that we're tracking, and if I was the person who made all of those sales, I should be able to notice if I'm missing 3 days worth of data, right? Or we've got many duplicates. It's just a practice. And then too, like checking it against your expectation. If my query returns 1.5 million lines and I was looking for 6 million, like there's probably something wrong. And so, just those little kind of checkpoints along the way, just to make sure everything's still what I expect it to be. And if it's not, I can trace back why it's not what I expected.
And I would just add that in terms of production data, anecdotal information is also important. I think sometimes we get headlong into, but I know for many production numbers, I'd look and be like, wow, that looks really low. I would go back and look at, okay, well, what happened that month? Well, half the staff was out sick. Well, obviously that's going to affect production. Or, oh, that's right, we had a late delivery. We didn't get something up to production fast enough. So it's showing a decrease in those production numbers, or we switched out a new machine. All of those anecdotal information can also lead you to additional information. I always tell companies, keep some kind of anecdotal or information about not just the numbers, about what's happening that day.
Yeah, and actually you're taking me toward like one of the questions I wanted to ask about, like the correction index or like I've seen some data reports where, okay, well, 60%, 70% of the people on a survey would think the same thing, but then there's 15% of people that would think something different, but that is noteworthy. How do you deal with correction index? How do you approach that question to help an organization understand the importance of what you call like anecdotal? What did you use?
Anecdotal information, or like what happened that day, not just the numbers, but the realities of that day. And sometimes our numbers, they're just numbers. And so sometimes you need the flavor to kind of really understand what those numbers mean.
If your sales are down on a random day and you realize, oh, that was Hoop Fest. If you didn't account for that in your data analysis, then your reporting is going to be kind of, it's going to reflect that oversight.
Do you have any additional thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah, I think just being able to maybe draw a distinction between information/data and knowledge and then wisdom somewhere up the scale, where if you aren't factoring in things other than just your data, then you're probably coming up short.
I feel like, every business in the world is based on interaction with people. Without that, you've got nothing. And you can't manage people to data. Right? People are complex human beings, individuals with different experiences and outlooks. And you can't show somebody a spreadsheet and say, see this, you're bad because the spreadsheet says so. So it's take a step back, make sure, you use data where data is applicable, you manage to realities. And so that's where this
Qualitative
information, the
quantitative,
qualitative information,
those qualitative and quantitative, they go together.
Ideas.
It's not just either or.
Did we have another question, or was there a question about marketing?
There is, yes. One of the other questions is, can you talk about your practices for how you collect data and phrase questions in a way that doesn't skew your data? So for example, like leading questions, or another example could be, if you enjoy working at this company, will you recommend it to your family and friends? How do you, can you talk about how you build your, how do you acquire the data so that it isn't skewed and that it is truly independent of a certain viewpoint?
I feel like there are really good, if you want to do it yourself, great resources online. Like go to LinkedIn Learning, how to conduct a survey. Right?
Available on the library.
Available through the library.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a lot of resources available for free online wherever your friends who are in marketing that can help you create non-leading questions, right? Or to make sure the question that you're asking is going to provide the answer that gives you the data that you need. And if you don't want to do it yourself, then make sure that you're working with a qualified professional and ask them about how they put together those things and what their philosophy is on how to ask those questions, and make your best judgment call, right?
And there's a whole study of the appropriate question to ask
Mhm.
for a survey. And so I think what you said is perfect. There are tons of online sources to help you, especially in that consumer feedback. And keeping in mind, like, once again, this is all nuance. Like if you're looking for consumer feedback, there are tons of free resources online through the library that will help you model those questions. I would say that keeping your response is better if you can keep those, shorter amount of questions, like 3 to 5. There's also data systems that can do that. Gusto is like my favorite payroll system, just because one of the things that I love it. One of the things it does is an employee satisfaction survey automatically. And so it will send out to all of your employees a satisfaction survey. So you're getting that internal data information about what's happening, and then do it regularly and try to stick to those same questions so you can see that change or adjustment over time. But don't go nuts, because it could be, trust me, I
It's
find
always good
myself in the whole just like, oh, but what if I use this word or this phrase? I think having a good Likert scale, and I will tell you, I have a preference for the 4-point Likert scale, which, so there's no middle, forcing that either or. I know that people hate it, but and there's things that, and you can learn about that and learn about what's right for your company. And I think that's like I said, that's kind of the fun of these things, is you get to kind of learn something in the process. And so those are just some of the ways that you can make sure that you're asking the right question and getting that right feedback.
Yeah, and I think, like also based on my experience when we worked on data collection surveys and things like that, sometimes we realize along the way that we don't have the perfect questions. And it's okay to redesign your survey along the way if it's going to serve your goal better. Sometimes you don't get it right the first time, and I think it's fine.
And your number, have a good target number. You definitely want to try to go at over 100. You want to be able to ask enough people the right question to make sure that, especially if you're surveying consumers of your service or your product, you really want to make sure that you have a good number of people that you're getting that information from.
And that goes down to understanding the point and the limitations of your data collection and analysis. Because if you've got less than 100 data points, hey, that's great for your customer service team. They can follow up with that and provide some awesome results, right? But that's not appropriate data to make decisions with. Make sure your sample size is large enough. So, it's just being familiar enough to understand what the data does and what it doesn't do, and where you can find usefulness in that.
And because you can get very caught up in the negative feedback, especially when you're doing consumer feedback, it can be, because you'll only get stuck on that one awful thing that somebody said about your company when you've served so many people who have had exceptional experiences. So try not to get hung up on those who did not appreciate, because I think we talk about that too. That's just not your right customer, and that's okay too. And don't beat yourself up, but that's why it's also nice to kind of have a good number of people with experience, so you don't get as caught up. You can say, but look at the 95% that have really had great experiences versus those 3 people that hate you.
On this note, I want to be mindful of everybody's time, and so this podcast will always be about an hour. A couple things. So there will be a recording online, living on a page of the library, I believe, and also on the Bill Consulting and Development website. So that will be available pretty soon. You should already have an email to reach us. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll be happy to answer to the best of our abilities. And we'll keep you informed for the next podcasts for the business of about. We'll keep you informed about the topic and the date, which should be around February 15th, but all that will be confirmed online. Thank you everybody for attending. Thank you to Library of Spokane, to the studio, Ryan and Alina. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Don. Thank you, Lou. And yeah, we'll see you on the next one.